You can use the grid, by the way, not only with your own manuscript, but it can be an interesting tool to work on a published book as a way of helping you see what the writer is up to. So for this demonstration, I picked out Dave at Night, a novel by Gail Carson Levine that I'd actually, many years ago, had some contact with when I was an editorial assistant and when it was still in an early version. So I feel a kind of personal connection to this story. By the way, as I said in my message to you about this, if you have not been able to get to the library or buy the book, though you really should buy the book, you can find the first 2 chapters of Dave at Night in Amazon's Inside the Book feature. And I'm not going to put that up on the screen here because I think that would get too busy. But if you want to look again at the grid later, you can do that and just pop that up on the screen for yourself, and you can go back and forth between the grid that I've produced and what you actually find in the story. So, stages for creating a grid. The first thing you want to do, though of course you can modify this as you go along, is you want to decide what you're actually going to keep track of, what you're going to make notes on. And I made a few changes to the standard grid before I even got started. I decided I wanted to make a note about the purpose of a particular scene and the emotions that seem to be evoked by that scene. Now, I could have done more. I might have wanted to keep track of who the characters were in that scene, or what actually happened in that scene. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I thought that would get to be a little too complicated and also a little tricky to manipulate with Word. So I kept it just to these: type of scene, location, purpose, and emotions. Those 4 things as I went through. That's in large part just to kind of manage what I see there just from having read it a little bit. It's a first-person account, so it's a little bit more inside Dave's head. So his emotions are very much a part of the story. And I thought that by focusing on them, that would help us see that kind of key part of it a little more clearly. So here's what I put down for the first chapter, which in the book is, I think, 6 pages. It's not a very long chapter. And it covers a surprising amount of ground. And here's where I had some interesting work with what I'm defining as a scene. The first couple of pages take place largely in Dave's head. Opens right up by telling us, in the space of a couple of paragraphs, that both of his parents are dead. His mother died giving birth to him, and his father, we find out at the end of this little sequence, just died at the now of the story. And it's a very interesting passage. There's some guilt, obviously, about his mother, but he's also kind of presenting this as somewhat of a joke. I've always made trouble. He then moves on another short passage to talk about another way he makes trouble, which is making trouble at school. And you see him basically standing up to bullies and getting into trouble for it, which then leads to, in this case, a memory and a very short scene, which I'm calling dialogue, because that's what it is. It's the scene that he plays over in his mind between himself and his father. With his father, he's got to watch himself, but can't really help himself in appreciating what it is that Dave has done at school. So that kind of brings us back to Papa who clearly was a loving character in his life, which then leads into another direction of Dave's thoughts, thinking about Papa and why he came to America. And from there, we transition back in a short paragraph. He's coming home from school. He gets home. His brother's sitting outside. His brother's been crying. There's something wrong. He doesn't know what yet. And then we get into the main scene of the chapter where Dave goes upstairs into their apartment and his father's lying on the sofa, dead, which he won't accept at first. He's in shock. He's in denial, and he actually tries to tell Papa a joke, and starts telling him a story about his stickball game. And it's a wrenching scene, and but it does not end like you might think it would, with Dave realizing what really has happened and accepting it and standing there and crying. That's not who Dave is. And he instead runs out of the apartment, going back to the park to show what he did with the stickball game that had been happening earlier. He's going to hit another home run like he did in the stickball game. And he runs back, and Gabriel, his brother, runs with him, and he tries to hit the ball with his stick, and he can't do it. And he keeps trying, and he can't do it. And that's when it hits him, and he starts crying. So really nice sequence of, I almost don't want to call them scenes because they're not. They're movements in Dave's head that leads to this one big dramatic scene where he's at home and the reality of what's happened to his father is confronting him. Then moving on from there to the second chapter, a little bit of a different setup. The first scene continues the action from the end of the first chapter. They go back home again from the park, and they get home and Papa's body isn't there. And Dave's reaction at first is that, oh, he got up. No, he's gone. He's been taken to the funeral home. And it's a very bleak moment. The next scene follows right on from there with a break. It's the next morning, and they are leaving for the cemetery, and in fact, driving in a car. Dave, his brother, his stepmother, I think an older relative in this car. He's never been in a car before. He's really interested in it. He moves from the seat to a kind of fold down seat that faces backward. He's very interested in this experience. And somehow he's able to just engage himself in this new experience of being in the car, the experience of being at the cemetery and the funeral. And I'm calling this all one long scene because although it's moving in the car to the cemetery, it's the same group of characters. And it's Dave kind of having this experience of going to the funeral. And finally, they return home, and there's another key scene where his whole extended family is in the apartment talking about what to do. And his stepmother is angry and upset and, making it clear that she can't keep the two boys on her own now that their father is dead. So there's a lot going on here. And I found it really interesting to work through what's there and put it into the grid format, because I realized that Gail's decision to tell us in the first person and give us access to Dave's thoughts made it possible for her to really do a lot in these first couple of chapters without us feeling rushed. Like, for example, in the beginning, and I'll just skip back here, those first 4 those first 4 scenes, which are all very much in Dave's head, there are 4 different things going on there, but they're all connected because they lead. I've always made trouble in relation to his parents leads to his thinking about the trouble he got into at school, which leads into him thinking about how his father reacted to that, which leads into him thinking about his father, and that in turn kind of brings him back to the current reality. It's a really nice sequence, something you would have a harder time doing if you were writing in third person, for example. So we really get to know Dave, or begin to get to know Dave. We see his active personality. He's resilient. He does stuff instead of worry and sit. He runs out and tries to hit the stickball. He moves into the backward-facing seat. He's not someone who just sits and waits for things to happen, and that will become important later in the story. It's nice to see how that works, and I think that the grid showed me that. Just the process of noting these things down and deciding, what are the key elements that I need to put into these specific boxes in the grid. That helps me think about the story, and then I can kind of look at it as a whole across the 2 chapters and think about how it's fitting together. And in the case of this story, here in this finished, published story, it's fitting together very nicely indeed. You might find when you set up a grid that it's a bit more of a challenge, and you'll start seeing gaps or other problems.